So in this edition of Gear Review, we're going to look at upgrading your graphics card, specifically for editors who are working in Premiere Pro. I recently did this as well, and I'm going to talk about my experiences with you. Stay tuned. There's a little bit of technical involved in this video, but you should be able to keep with me. So you've got an older editor workstation like mine. Perhaps you built it yourself, and it was a powerhouse at the time you built it. But that performance is now lagged, and it's about 6 to 7 years later, and you're looking for ways to keep that performance going. You also may want to get into 4K video. So what do? You've upgraded every component in the computer except for the graphics card. So will upgrading this one component give you a lot more performance in Adobe Premiere Pro? I'm going to be talking about Adobe Creative Cloud software, specifically Premiere Pro CC. At the time of this recording, the version was 13.1.2. However, some elements of this video I had at 13.0.2. As time goes on, more and more support for acceleration and newer video cards is taking place. As Adobe software continues to improve and take advantage of hardware features and newer graphics cards, things will improve. So the obvious choice for most people is just go out and buy a new computer, but it can be daunting. There are so many options out there for editing workstations, from less advanced workstations all the way up to 8K editing solutions. So the sky's the limit in terms of hardware that you can pick. However, what I suggest is that you choose hardware that's going to be right for the job you're doing. So most people don't have all the money now to buy a whole new workstation for the job that they actually need to do. So what can you do instead? Well, you can buy a component, and that component can be the graphics card. New hardware is always usually pretty good, but the question is, can the old work with the new? As in computers, a lot of things that are old do not always work with the new. For those viewers who don't like to get into the nitty-gritty of the tech details, you may want to have somebody else install a graphics card for you if that's the route you decide to go. One thing's for certain, this is what we want to avoid. And performance is really going to depend on what it is you're doing and what your system is capable of. So the best way to dive into this is basically to ask yourself 4 main questions. So performance is all relative. We're going to take a look at some of the specs that you need in order to make this work. Question 2 is the main question of this video, which is, will the new GPU upgrade actually increase performance the way we expect in Premiere Pro? Question 3 is, will upgrading give me any new features or capability I didn't have before? Ultimately, question 4 is going to be answered by your budget as well as your decision after this video. So the GPU I'm talking about today is the NVIDIA RTX 2070 by Gigabyte. I went with this particular GPU for a number of reasons. One was it has a triple fan design. The 2070s also seemed to be a good choice, as the 2080s were just too expensive for me. This card has 8 gigabytes of memory, which is 4 times the amount I had in my old card. Power consumption is relatively good as well. The cost to performance ratio on this card seemed really reasonable for an RTX 2070 card, and I happened to take advantage of a really good sale at the time. In my case, I'm upgrading a PC, but here are the requirements you're going to need to know before you put a new graphics card in. I realize I am going over these quite quickly. Please feel free to pause the video and go back. If you have any more questions about upgrading your graphics card as far as the technical requirements, visit your local computer store and they should be able to help you. So the old graphics card was about 4 generations older than the new one I got. I wanted to learn about the actual performance features of the new card in relation to the old card and how it affects Premiere Pro. For that, we go to NVIDIA's website. The heart of the performance is actually in the hardware details themselves. So I wanted to find out exactly what was supported on my particular card, as well as what works in Premiere. So most of the functionality in these graphics cards is for gamers. These cards really aren't meant for video professionals like us. However, there are a lot of features that NVIDIA packs into them so that you can use them for video. Now, what's interesting to me is a lot of these numbers and specs talk about the top-end card's features and capabilities, but that's not true for all of the different family models underneath. So, for example, the 2070, it doesn't have all the same feature set, although it shares most of them. Just to give you an example of that, the top-end card has a lot more actual CUDA cores than the 2070 does. For the people who are a lot less tech-savvy, what that basically means is there are compromises that they made in the lower-end products from the higher-end product in order to create a market and charge a lower price. But what does this have to do with video editing? Well, the options we really need to look at here are the encode and decode hardware aspects of the card. This basically tells you that these codecs are supported in hardware, which is going to give you a performance boost when Premiere Pro is set to hardware accelerated. So let's go into a little more detail in a presentation I found from NVIDIA that details this a bit more. So this document clearly shows what decode codecs and encode codecs the hardware actually will support. So note here that you don't see any formats like Cineform or ProRes listed as hardware encoded or decoded. That's because the actual hardware is supporting the native codec, H.264, H.265, etc. Keep in mind, Apple ProRes is an intermediate editing codec. Most of these formats are for the end user. They're made to be displayed on a television or streamed over the internet. YouTube, for example, uses H.264 and H.265 as its display codec. These display codecs tend to be very CPU heavy, which is why hardware encoding and decoding is necessary. As most consumer and prosumer cameras are now recording in a lot of these formats for CPU reasons and space-saving reasons, we can take advantage of the hardware in a GPU in order to use them in our editing suite. So one thing I actually learned while researching this is about the GH5. You'll notice in this frame, 422 is not supported in hardware. It's either 420, which is normal 8-bit 4K footage, for example, or 4K 444 footage, which is basically a 10-bit, unlimited color space kind of format. For those that don't know what I'm talking about, check out 422 or 444 and learn all about color sampling, also known as chroma subsampling. So this was a bit of a shock to me because as I am a GH5 user, my 422 10-bit footage is not being accelerated in the Adobe Premiere timeline, nor can I accelerate it if I ever tried to export it in that format. This could explain a lot of times where I'm getting jerky footage, or the fact that when I go to render something, it's always saying software encoding and not hardware encoding. This was kind of a light bulb moment for me. What this also unfortunately means is that my workflow is going to have to change a bit in order to get the accelerated effects that I need while I'm working. So my normal method of working is basically to make sure my previews are set to a proxy or an intermediate codec format. For an older system, you can reduce the load on the system by shrinking the resolution while you're working, and you get much faster playback results. The thinking is with proxies is that you're converting it to an intermediate format to work with, and you're also keeping a lot of the detail as high as you would like to in the actual source files. This frees up your CPU enormously. Now, Premiere will work with all types of files in the timeline. However, performance is going to vary greatly depending on how those files are structured. The more CPU-intensive codec is used, the more Premiere is going to have a problem. This is why an intermediary codec or a proxy can help with performance on the machine, usually. One simple tip you can use to see if you are dropping frames is to turn on the Show Dropped Frames indicator. However, just keep in mind that this could also be a result of your hard drive speed or another component in your computer becoming the bottleneck. So for time's sake in this video, I didn't include any of the real tests, all of the tests that I did. Some of them didn't work out and I wasn't able to get a concise sort of set, but what I did come up with is 4 main areas in performance that editors really want to pay attention to. So to answer question 2, we have to go in depth a bit. So as I mentioned before, we have 4 main areas of performance in Premiere to think about. The first is the capture format, or what your camera is actually capturing the format in. So our first area of performance is going to be determined by the capture codec that's going into Premiere. This will also save time if you don't have to convert the file. Depending on what your workflow goals are, the format is really going to determine your performance level. Intermediate formats are specifically designed to help with larger type formats like in 6K, 8K footage and be able to manage it on the timeline. Keep in mind that most intermediary codecs are not hardware accelerated. If you are finding difficulties, you have a couple options in order to improve your performance on the timeline itself. You can decide to transcode the footage, which will assist in the timeline performance. You could do a performance render every time you need to make a change, or you could try to keep the footage as real time if your hardware supports it. Third area is the actual timeline editing playback, and this is when you fully loaded everything up with effects and everything you're doing on the timeline. Can you do color grading? Does everything play back okay at that point? A new GPU can definitely help with timeline editing and playback performance if the effects that you're using are actually made to run on a GPU. And last but not least, the timeline export itself. How fast can you make that? So all the other videos on YouTube typically talk about the timeline export performance, which is important for editors because getting out your content in a timely manner is important. However, the key is to note is that all the other things you've done before that in the performance from options 1 to 3 are going to affect this timeline export performance. If most of your exports are for an end user format, like for YouTube for example, the GPU can help greatly. In my case, adding the graphics card actually added features to my machine, which I didn't previously have. Like, for example, the 8K, being able to play back those files, playing 4K better, and adding more RAM to the graphics card itself, which helps tremendously in Premiere or any CUDA operations. More CPU processing power is important, and I do advise you to upgrade your computer at some point, but the graphics card will let you offload a lot of that processing capability where CUDA has been programmed into Premiere Pro. So is upgrading your graphics card to something like this worth it? My answer is yes. Look for a future workflow video where I'm going to go more in depth with the encode and decode abilities of hardware. My goal in the next video will hopefully be to get more performance out of a limited system. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe down below and hit that bell notification icon so you get notified of any future videos. Also, don't forget to check out these other videos. And stop by the Karr Galaxy Studios merch store for some artwork and other merchandise items.